It begins with a map, not just any map, but one that shouldn't exist. A map drawn centuries ago, carefully inked by hands that believed they were documenting the world as it truly was. And yet across its surface, stretching from Eastern Europe to the edges of Asia, there appears a name that feels strangely unfamiliar today: Tartaria. Not a city, not a small region, but something vast, something that spans entire continents, labeled clearly, confidently, as if there were no doubt it existed. And yet, if you search for it now, if you open modern textbooks or scroll through accepted history, Tartaria is barely mentioned, if at all, reduced to a footnote, dismissed as a vague term for unknown lands. But how could something so enormous simply disappear? Not physically, but from memory itself. How does an empire vanish without leaving behind a story everyone agrees on? And, perhaps more importantly, why does it feel like it was never meant to be remembered in the first place? As you look deeper into these old records, something begins to feel off. Explorers, cartographers, encyclopedias, from the 16th to the 18th century, all reference Tartary in ways that don't quite align. Some describe it as a massive region inhabited by diverse peoples, others hint at structured territories, organized governance, even something resembling a unified presence. The inconsistency itself becomes the first clue, because history, when it is real and intact, tends to converge toward clarity over time, not drift further into confusion. And yet with Tartaria, the more sources you examine, the less certain everything becomes. It's as if the narrative was never fully allowed to form, or perhaps it was broken apart deliberately. And then there's the architecture, the silent witnesses scattered across the world, buildings from the 1800s that seem impossibly advanced, structures with enormous domes, intricate facades, and engineering precision that raises an uncomfortable question. Were these really built with the technology we're told existed at the time? Or are we looking at remnants of something older, something inherited rather than created? Photographs from the 19th century only deepen the mystery. Grainy black and white images show massive cities, grand avenues, towering buildings, and yet something is missing: the people. Streets that should be filled with life appear strangely empty, as if the world itself had paused, or perhaps had not yet fully begun. And then come the world's fairs, events that on the surface seem celebratory, exhibitions of progress and innovation. But when you examine them closely, they begin to feel almost unreal. Entire cities constructed in astonishing detail, vast complexes of buildings that look permanent, monumental, far beyond what would be expected for temporary displays. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone, demolished within months, leaving behind only photographs and questions. Why build something so elaborate only to destroy it? Why erase something that could have stood for generations? Unless it was never meant to remain. Unless it was something that had to be hidden, rebranded, or removed entirely. And this is where the theories begin to divide, where the story fractures into possibilities that no one fully agrees on. Some argue that Tartary was nothing more than a label, a convenient term used by Europeans to describe lands they did not yet understand, a placeholder for the unknown. But others look at the patterns, the architecture, the maps, and they see something else entirely: a lost civilization, possibly global in scale, with knowledge and technology that does not fit neatly into the timeline we've been given. Some believe these structures were not just buildings, but part of a larger system, perhaps even designed to harness energy in ways we no longer recognize. And then there are the more unsettling ideas, whispers of a reset, a catastrophic event that reshaped the world, burying cities, rewriting narratives, leaving behind fragments that no longer make sense when viewed through the lens of modern history. A mud flood, a deliberate erasure, a moment where whatever came before was wiped away and replaced with a new version of the past. But here's the thing: no matter which theory you lean toward, none of them fully explain everything. The maps are real, the buildings existed, the photographs were taken, and yet the connections between them remain just out of reach, like pieces of a puzzle that almost fit but never quite lock into place. And maybe that's what makes this story so compelling. Not that it provides answers, but that it refuses to settle into one. Because if even a small part of this is true, if Tartaria was more than just a name on a map, then it suggests something far more unsettling than a lost civilization. It suggests that history itself might not be as stable as we believe, that what we accept as truth may have been shaped, filtered, or even rewritten in ways we don't fully understand. So now the question shifts. Not just what was Tartaria, but what else might be missing? What other chapters of human history could have been altered, simplified, or erased entirely? And if something so vast could fade from collective memory, then what does that say about the stories we trust today? Were they preserved, or were they curated? And who decides which parts of the past survive and which are allowed to disappear? Because once you start asking these questions, it becomes difficult to stop. The maps begin to look different. The buildings feel out of place. The timelines start to blur. And suddenly, the world you thought you understood doesn't feel quite as solid as it once did. And maybe that's where the real story begins, not in the past, but in the moment you start to question it. Because once the idea takes hold that something as vast as Tartaria could slip through the cracks of recorded history, it changes the way you look at everything else. Old photographs are no longer just images. They become evidence, fragments of a world that feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Buildings that once seemed ordinary begin to stand out, their scale, their detail, their purpose suddenly harder to explain. Even the timeline of progress, the story of how civilization advanced step by step, starts to feel less like a straight line and more like something interrupted, something restarted. There are those who say this is simply the nature of history, that gaps and inconsistencies are inevitable, that names change, borders shift, and what was once misunderstood eventually becomes clearer. But with Tartaria, clarity never fully arrives. Instead, the deeper you go, the more the edges blur. The maps don't agree, the records contradict each other, and the physical remnants, those silent, immovable structures, seem to resist simple explanations. It's as if they belong to a narrative we no longer have access to, a chapter that was removed before we even knew it existed. And yet, the idea refuses to disappear. It lingers in online forums, in old archives, in the quiet curiosity of those who notice that something doesn't quite add up. It lives in the questions people are almost hesitant to ask out loud. What if our understanding of history is incomplete? Not because we haven't discovered everything yet, but because some things were intentionally left out, not destroyed entirely, but obscured just enough to fade into ambiguity, replaced with simpler explanations, easier narratives, stories that are easier to teach, easier to accept. Because if there was something before, something larger, more advanced, or simply different from what we've been told, then acknowledging it would mean rethinking everything that came after. It would mean reconsidering progress, technology, even the origins of the modern world itself. And that's not a small shift, that's a complete redefinition of the timeline we rely on to understand who we are. So maybe Tartaria isn't just about a lost civilization. Maybe it's about the limits of what we're allowed to remember, about how easily something can move from certainty to obscurity to myth, and how, over time, the absence of evidence can become its own kind of evidence, not of something that never existed, but of something that was never meant to be fully known again. And the next time you see an old photograph, or a building that feels out of place, or a map that doesn't quite match what you were taught, you might pause for just a second longer. You might look a little closer, because the question is no longer just what happened to Tartaria, but what else might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice that it was there all along. And once you begin to notice it, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. The patterns start to repeat in ways that feel too consistent to ignore. Cities across different continents sharing architectural features that seem oddly synchronized. Domes, arches, intricate stonework that appears not just decorative but purposeful. Buildings labeled as courthouses, train stations, or exhibition halls that look more like something inherited than constructed, as if they belong to a different era entirely, one whose identity has been quietly reassigned. Even the pace of construction in the 1800s begins to raise questions. Entire city centers, massive in scale and rich in detail, appearing within what seems like impossibly short time frames. Official records often credit these feats to rapid industrial progress, to manpower, to innovation. And yet, when you compare the tools, the logistics, the infrastructure of that time, something doesn't quite align. It's not that it would have been impossible, but it feels incomplete, like part of the explanation is missing, or perhaps has been simplified into something more acceptable. Some believe that what we're seeing are not the creations of that era, but the remnants of something that came before, repurposed, renamed, and gradually absorbed into a new narrative. That the cities we recognize today may have been built upon the foundations of a civilization whose identity has faded, leaving behind only the structures that were too large, too durable, or too useful to destroy entirely. Others argue that this is simply a reinterpretation of history, a tendency to project mystery onto the past when faced with things we don't immediately understand. And maybe that's true, but even then, the question remains, why does this particular mystery feel so persistent, so resistant to closure? Because most historical uncertainties eventually narrow down, new evidence emerges, theories evolve, and a clearer picture takes shape. But Tartaria doesn't follow that pattern. It sits in a kind of limbo, where the evidence is just visible enough to spark curiosity, but never complete enough to settle the debate. And in that space between certainty and doubt, something interesting happens. People start to look closer, to question more, to revisit things they once accepted without hesitation. And perhaps that's the real significance of this story. Not whether Tartaria was a global empire, or a misunderstood region, or something else entirely, but what it reveals about how we engage with the past, about how easily narratives can solidify into truth, and how difficult it can be to challenge them once they do. Because history isn't just a record of what happened, it's a collection of stories that survived, shaped by those who recorded them, preserved by those who chose to pass them on. So if there were stories that didn't survive, or weren't allowed to, they wouldn't disappear completely. They would leave behind traces, inconsistencies, questions that don't quite resolve. And those traces would remain, scattered across maps, photographs, buildings, waiting for someone to notice that they don't fully fit the narrative we've been given. Which brings us back to where we started. A map, a name, a civilization that may or may not have existed in the way we imagine it. But regardless of what the final answer might be, the impact is already there. Because once you've considered the possibility, even briefly, that history might hold more than what we've been taught, it changes the way you see everything that came after. So the next time you hear a story presented as absolute, as complete, as unquestionable, you might remember this. You might wonder what parts of that story are still missing, what details have been simplified, what perspectives have been left out. And you might realize that the search for truth isn't just about finding answers, it's about being willing to question the ones you already have. And maybe that's the quiet shift this story leaves behind. Not a conclusion, not a final answer neatly wrapped and explained, but a different way of looking at everything that surrounds you. Because once the idea settles, in that entire chapters of history could be incomplete, fragmented, or even reshaped, it doesn't just stay attached to Tartaria. It begins to extend outward, touching other moments, other timelines, other stories that suddenly feel less certain than they once did. You start to notice how often history relies on confidence rather than clarity. Dates, names, events presented as fixed points, even when the evidence behind them is thin, debated, or interpreted through limited perspectives. And in most cases, that system works well enough to give us a sense of continuity, a shared understanding of where we came from. But every so often, something like Tartaria appears, something that doesn't quite fit, something that resists being placed neatly into the timeline, and instead of being explored fully, it's reduced, simplified, or quietly set aside, not necessarily out of conspiracy, but perhaps out of convenience. Because the more complex the past becomes, the harder it is to teach, to organize, to explain in a way that feels stable. And stability, in many ways, is what people seek from history. A clear line from then to now, a sense that everything unfolded in a way that makes sense. But reality isn't always that cooperative. Sometimes it's layered, messy, filled with gaps that don't easily close. And in those gaps, imagination and inquiry begin to overlap. Some will fill them with theories of lost empires and advanced technologies. Others will approach them with skepticism, looking for grounded explanations that align with established knowledge. And somewhere between those two approaches, the truth, whatever it may be, remains just out of reach, shaped by perspective, limited by evidence, and constantly evolving as new information comes to light. But what makes Tartaria different is not just the mystery itself, it's how persistent it is, how it continues to resurface, to be rediscovered by people who had never heard of it before, who stumble across an old map or a photograph and feel that same moment of hesitation, that same quiet question forming in their mind. Because that moment, that pause, is where curiosity begins. And curiosity has a way of leading people further than they expect. So whether Tartaria was a vast civilization lost to time, a misunderstood label for distant lands, or something in between, its presence, however faint, serves as a reminder that history is not just something we inherit, it's something we interpret. And interpretation is never final. It shifts, it adapts, it reflects not only what we know, but what we're willing to question. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not proving or disproving a single idea, but keeping the door open to possibilities. Because once that door closes, once every question is treated as settled, curiosity fades, and with it, the chance to see the past and the present from a different perspective. So if you've stayed with this story until now, if you've followed each question as it unfolded, then you're already part of that process. You're already looking a little closer, thinking a little deeper, noticing the details that might have once been overlooked. And whether you see Tartaria as mystery, myth, or something more, the fact that you're questioning it at all means the story is still alive. And as long as a story remains alive, it continues to evolve. Not because the past itself is changing, but because our understanding of it never stands still. Each generation looks back with new questions, new perspectives, new tools. And sometimes, what once seemed settled begins to shift again. Details that were overlooked gain new attention. Fragments that felt insignificant start to connect. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative expands. Tartaria exists in that space, not fully accepted, not fully dismissed, but suspended somewhere in between, where curiosity keeps it moving forward. And maybe that's why it continues to draw people in. Not because it offers certainty, but because it challenges it. It asks you to hold two ideas at once, that what we know is valuable, and that what we don't know might be just as important. Because every piece of history we accept today was once uncertain. Every discovery began as a question that didn't quite fit the established view. And while not every mystery leads to a hidden truth, the act of questioning itself is what allows understanding to grow. Without it, history becomes static, frozen in place, immune to revision, even when new evidence suggests it should change. So perhaps Tartaria is less about uncovering a single lost civilization and more about recognizing the limits of what has been preserved, about understanding that absence does not always mean non-existence, and that silence in the historical record can sometimes speak just as loudly as documented events. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts, it's a process, one that depends on interpretation, preservation, and, sometimes, omission. And if that's true, then the real question isn't just what happened to Tartaria, but how many other stories might exist in that same quiet space. Stories that were never fully recorded, never fully understood, or perhaps never fully allowed to remain. Stories that linger in fragments, waiting for someone to notice that something doesn't quite add up. Because once you accept that possibility, even for a moment, it changes the way you see the world around you. It adds a layer beneath the surface, a sense that what's visible might only be part of a much larger picture. And while that picture may never be complete, the act of searching for it, of questioning, of exploring, of staying curious, that's where the real discovery happens. So, whether Tartaria was an empire, a misunderstanding, or something we haven't yet found the words to describe, it has already done something significant. It has made you pause. It has made you wonder. And in a world where so much feels certain, that moment of uncertainty might be the most important clue of all. What do you think? Was Tartaria a real forgotten civilization that once shaped the world, or just a misunderstood label lost in translation over time? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every perspective adds another piece to the puzzle. If you're drawn to mysteries like this, to the hidden layers of history that challenge what we think we know, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And if this story made you question even one thing you thought was certain, consider sharing it with someone else who's willing to look a little deeper. Because sometimes, the most important discoveries aren't the ones we're told, but the ones we're left to find on our own.